This is a production of Cornell University.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Sage Wednesdays at Sage Chapel. Sage Wednesdays, as they have evolved during this past semester, have been a place for the articulation and expression of a public theology and a public philosophy, as well as an opportunity to address the issues related to the personal pursuit of meaning and purpose. Today, we focus on the public theology side of what Sage Wednesdays has to offer. The focus of our time today together, Black theology, has always been, in effect, a public theology. If one considers, for instance, the typology that Cornell West provides in his book Prophesy Deliverance, an Afro-American Revolutionary Christianity, Black theology began in its earliest manifestation in American society as a critique against slavery. In more recent manifestations, it has evolved as a theology of struggle against segregation, and later a critique of white North American theology, moving through different stages over time. It has had a more specifically academic manifestation since approximately 1966, when it emerged amidst the Black freedom struggle in the U.S. during that time. One of the features of Black theology that has made it a public theology is that one of its salient contributions to theological discourse has to do with the fact that it is asserted that all theology is shaped and informed by socio-political context. For Black people, persons of African descent, whether in the United States or in the Caribbean or in Africa, and wherever the African diaspora might present itself in other nations, that context has been a history of struggle and achievement against racism and other forms of social injustice. Black theology became a prominent feature of the presidential primary campaign earlier this year due to the media coverage related to excerpts extracted from the sermons of Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright, Jr., Pastor Emeritus of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. However, the media coverage, with some notable exceptions, tended to generate far more heat than light on what Black theology indeed is and what it represents for the larger society. Our speaker today is a preeminent scholar in the field of Black theology and who will provide for us the light necessary to understand Black theology more comprehensively. Dr. Dwight N. Hopkins is professor of theology at the University of Chicago Divinity School, a constructive theologian working in the areas of contemporary models of theology, Black theology, and other liberation theologies. He is interested in multidisciplinary approaches to the academic study of religious thought, especially cultural, political, economic, and interpretive methods. His latest works are Being Human, Race, Culture, and Religion, Walk Together Children, Black and Womanist Theologies, Church and Theological Education, and Another World is Possible, Spiritualities and Religions of Global Darker Peoples. Professor Hopkins is the senior editor of the Henry McNeil Turner Sojourner Truth series in Black Religion, a series of publications published by Orbis Books. He is also an ordained American Baptist minister. Today, Dr. Hopkins will speak to us about Black theology in the presidential campaign following an organ selection by Tim Piper.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here in this sacred place of Ithaca and Sage Chapel. First, I want to, of course, thank CURW for this invitation to share some brief remarks with you on the theme, and specifically to Dr. Kenneth Clark for his personal invitation, and also to Reverend Joe Tagliaferri. So again, thank you. I've been asked to speak on the topic of Black theology in the 2008 presidential race. One of the fascinating developments in the 2008 presidential election has been the insertion of Black religion and Black theology into the discourse. For instance, on February 10th, 2007, Senator Barack Obama announced his candidacy for the White House. Shortly after, the New York Times newspaper published an article that suggested that Obama was beginning to distance himself from his pastor, Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright, Jr., and that Obama might be linked to a radical form of Black Christianity. Occasionally throughout 2007, some corporate media attempted to link Reverend Wright with Minister Louis Farrakhan because Reverend Wright was Obama's pastor. Then, in the logic of some corporate media, Obama was tethered to Farrakhan. Yet, despite these sort of tidbits and nibbling around the topic, the controversy did not gain traction until the beginning of 2008. On Thursday, March 13th, 2008, America and the world woke up to an amazing media production. On that day, ABC television released a 30-second soundbite of 3 of Reverend Wright's sermons. The public saw 10 seconds each of 3 sermon excerpts. By the next day, February the 14th, the #1 American presidential news in the United States, and increasingly globally, were the following questions. How could Senator Obama have such an angry, racist in reverse, non-patriotic Black pastor? And was this the form of Black religion that Obama believed in? Not only did some corporate media, Republican candidates, and at that time Senator Hillary Clinton's campaign, began to raise questions about Obama, but the very base of his campaign supporters became shocked. On that Friday, the day after the ABC release on Thursday, the blog site of BarackObama.com, one could find some of Obama's staunchest supporters trembling in confusion, fear, and suspicion. It seemed as if Obama's ground troops were disintegrated. In fact, the contention and the anger on that website were so deep that some Obama supporters were accusing other bloggers of being Hillary Clinton trolls. A troll is when one presidential candidate's supporters blogs onto the website of an oppositional candidate's blog site in order to intentionally cause disruption and sow false information among that candidate's core supporters. On that same Friday afternoon, I was in the Fox News studio, television news studio, about to go on live television, when one of the reporters called me over and said that he was printing a major news development. We waited for the printer to stop. Then he handed me a statement by Senator Obama. Obama announced in this brief press release that he denounced the 30-second sound bites from the previous day and that he was not present when they were preached. I went on Fox television, and of course the very first question I was asked were, did I agree with, quote, God damn America? And did I, quote, agree with 9/11 meant chickens coming home to roost? Over that weekend, a political storm unfolded, and the domestic and global media looped the 30-second sound bites over and over. The following Tuesday, I was in the National Public Radio, NPR studio in downtown Chicago, doing a live radio interview when our program was cut short because Obama was about to begin a live broadcast. Everyone hurried to the back of the studio where 6 TV monitors hung on the walls. I grabbed a seat on the floor and watched Obama's a more perfect union speech. Standing in Philadelphia, draped in American flags, Obama gave his first major speech on race, religion, and the black church. Still, the uproar persisted. Every day for about 3 weeks, I did television, radio, magazine, newspaper, web interviews on the topic of black religion, the black church, and black theology liberation. During one of those weeks, I had to cancel and reschedule classes for a later date due to media interview requests. My email, home phone, cell phone messages were filling up, and I did media literally from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. for those 7 days. The questions of reporters began to repeat themselves. What is black religion? What is the black church? And what is black liberation theology? These requests from media continued for several weeks. However, as the country and the world moved away from the initial 30-second sound bites, the media questions started to ask for a more nuanced explanation. Then Reverend Wright announced a major press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. On Monday, April 28th, I sat at a VIP table in front of the podium as Reverend Wright gave his statement and then suggested in the now famous question and answer session. Immediately, Senator Obama held his own press conference where he condemned Wright's remarks and stated that for him, Obama, Wright's remarks did not represent the black church known by Obama. Here, the leading Democratic presidential candidate, and probably the first black American president in the United States history, placed black religion, black church, and black theology liberation at the center of American and global political discourse. Clearly, the black church as an invisible institution had become visible for all to see. From Friday, March 14th until this week, actually November 3rd, I have been doing media. Major U.S. corporate media, independent media, local media, media interviews from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Canada, Latin America, and Europe, and blog sites. What is clear to me is a need for a nationwide conversation on black religion, the black church, and black liberation theology. In fact, to understand the phrase black liberation theology, or black liberation theology, or black theology liberation, it is helpful to define each of the three terms in that phrase. The word theology simply means that black theology liberation is rooted in the Christian tradition. That is to say, Christianity begins with the historical Jesus, through the disciples of the early church, and its eventual spread throughout church tradition of the last 2,000 years. And the word liberation in the phrase black theology liberation denotes a belief that the framework, ministry, and orientation of Jesus is liberation. And the word black in the phrase black theology liberation answers the question of how do theology and liberation manifest in African American culture or black culture. Thus, black liberation theology is focused on these three themes. It is rooted in the Christian tradition, wedded to the gospel of liberation, and revealed in black culture. Though these three themes can be found in the origin and historical development of black religion and the black church since slavery in the U.S., the specific phrase black theology liberation is a recent phenomenon, and it arose in the 1960s. Specifically on July 31st, 1966, a group of African-American pastors and church administrators published a full-page ad in the New York Times newspaper. This ad was called the Black Power Statement, and it actually supported the new agenda of Black Power. The ad was a direct response to the cry of Black Power that Stokely Carmichael made on June 16, 1966. At that time, Black Power was a bold move on the part of the youth wing of the civil rights movement. It spread throughout society and forced various groups to respond. And the black clergy who published the ad were caught in a dilemma. As Christian pastors who were staunch participants in Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent civil rights movement, they were now confronted with the fundamental question in America. What does blackness have to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ? In a word, was it possible to be both black and Christian? This was the defining question which black theology answered in 1966. As these then young, very young African-American pastors and church administrators thought about this question, others were already giving their answers. At that time, many in America gave a negative response to the question. They believed that a person could not be both black and Christian. Many in the white community associated the Black Power movement with terrorism, racism in reverse, Malcolm X, law-breaking radicals, unpatriotic militants brandishing guns against the status quo. So how could this type of blackness be linked to the religion of Jesus? And even the black community had its doubters and said, no, you could not be black and Christian. For instance, Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam said people could not be both Christian and black because Christianity was, quote, the white man's religion. It was the religion used by the white citizens to enslave Africans. It justified and supported slavery for almost 3 centuries in North America. It was a religion that gave blacks a pacifist Jesus and a hope in heaven by and by, while white Christians had their heaven on earth. So Christianity for Malcolm X was white supremacist tricknology, in his phrase. So too, black militants and revolutionaries such as the Black Panther Party said that Christianity was the opium of the black people, suited for Negro Uncle Toms. Negro preachers were sellouts who fed on the financial insecurity of poor people. Indeed, power might have to grow out of the barrel of a gun and not from a hocus-pocus Christian Bible. They too believed one could not be black and Christian. Moreover, black artists used poetry and fiction to show how Christianity blocked the flourishing of the new African and African-American aesthetic, with its emphasis on Egypt and African traditional spirituality and Pan-Africanism. And at that time, some of the major black artists and poets, such as Leroy Jones at that time, were major critiques of the notion of being black and Christian, saying that was impossible. And Martin Luther King Jr. himself, coming from the perspective of supporting Christianity, as well as his preacher colleagues, also stated that one could not be black and Christian. They believed Christianity was a nonviolent, love your enemy and turn the other cheek religion. In radical contrast, they felt King and his lieutenants at that time felt that black power was violence and hatred. So again, one could not be Christian and black. King believed that one could be Negro, he said, and Christian, but not black and Christian. We know that the Civil Rights Movement begins December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, with the boycott of Dr. King and him leading that along with the black church and its allies. The black church, particularly in the South, is the leadership of this civil rights movement. And they struggled for voting rights, and they struggled for human rights. In the North, there was a different reality. And a lot of the issues that blacks in the South and their allies were fighting for did not resonate in a big way with blacks in ghettos and the nitty-gritty intensity of being black in the North. But even when the African-American church was leading struggles in the South, it came to a point where a younger generation of Negro youth, which eventually became black youth, became very dissatisfied with the pace of the black church, with some of the theology and interpretation of Christianity by Dr. King and his lieutenants, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So the pace of the struggle in the South, the message of the struggle, and even how Dr. King and some of his black clergy in the South were relating to the federal government, all these things came together when the youth wing of the civil rights movement, particularly led by Stokely Carmichael, became very frustrated with what they were experiencing. They wanted their justice, they wanted their civil rights, they wanted their power now. And so they came up with that phrase of black power in 1966 to express that vision and that frustration. So that is why the following question came to the surface. Okay, if the black church is being discredited or is not as relevant in the North, and if the black church is also being outstripped by the new youth wing of the movement, then in the South, then what is the role of Christianity or religion in social justice for the Negro Revolution and eventually the Black Power consciousness movement? In the midst of this national firestorm over race, religion, and the future of America, over the question of whether or not one could be black and Christian, and over the question of whether or not Christianity had a role in the struggle for social justice. Black pastors and church administrators, led by James H. Cone, resolved this question of could one be both black and Christian. In March of 1969, James Cone published his first book called Black Theology and Black Power. In this text, Cone asserted that the message of the gospel is liberation. Jesus, in Cone's view, had one purpose. He came to liberate the poor, the oppressed, and those emotionally abused. Similarly, black people were poor, oppressed, and emotionally abused. They, like Jesus, were organizing for liberation. So if the purpose of Jesus was for the liberation of the oppressed, and oppressed black citizens were struggling for liberation, then it followed that Jesus worked in oppressed black communities for liberation. If these facts were not true, Cone and his colleagues argued, it would contradict the very message of the Bible. And so Dr. Cone comes into the picture and begins to try to articulate how one can still be Christian on the one hand and also be relevant to the new movement of black power and black consciousness. And so he wrote that first book, Black Theology and Black Power, which basically said there is no contradiction between the social justice movement of black power and the civil rights and the message of Jesus Christ. He goes on to say, in fact, black power is for liberation, Jesus Christ is for liberation, and not only is Christianity not anathema to black power is the contemporary expression of Jesus Christ in America. With his theological interpretation and his sociological analysis of America, Cone asserted that the message of Jesus was not antithetical to black power. Quite the contrary. Black power for him and his colleagues was the message of Jesus for all of America. During the midst of the rise of black power in 1966 and the 1968 rebellions and riots that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., many black churches in urban America were trying to define the future direction of being black and being Christian. The founders of black theology struggled with this issue of being black and being Christian. Cone struggled with this issue in his first book of Being Black and Being Christian. And on the ground, in many communities, local congregations were also struggling with this issue. How can we as a church in the inner city ghetto be Christian, accountable to the gospel message, and be black, accountable to the relevant development of black power and black consciousness? During 1971, one of these churches, struggling with how to live out the theological conclusion that a person could be both black and Christian, was Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago. During that year, 1971, they only had 87 members. At that time, they decided to not leave the urban area and move to the suburbs. Rather, they chose to try and build on their understanding of the Bible's salvation and liberation right in the oppressed inner city of Chicago. When the church decided that it would cast its lot with the poor and workers of the South Side, and when it decided that they were going to answer the question of being black and Christian, the Pulpit Search Committee hired Jeremiah Wright Jr. in March of 1972. The 87-member congregation gave the following instructions to Jeremiah Wright. They wanted him to apply a relevant gospel to black culture and to the economic and political plight of black Americans on the south side of Chicago. Through focusing on these forgotten citizens of America, Trinity Church hoped to redeem the soul of all America. Under Wright's leadership, members of the surrounding community and others from faraway neighborhoods began to join Trinity. He was successful in bringing in families and also black men back into the church. By 1981, Trinity had refined its theological focus. Because it had made a conscious decision to relate to the specific conditions of the communities that surrounded it in the Chicago ghettos, it wrote 2 statements to fulfill its mission. In other words, the conditions in which the church found itself impacted the specific way the church applied the biblical call for love and liberation in those conditions. The first document is Trinity's statement of self-reflection, which reads, quote, "We are a congregation which is unashamedly black and unapologetically Christian. Our roots in the black religious experience and tradition are deep, lasting, and permanent. We are an African people and remain true to our native land, the mother continent, the cradle of civilization. God has superintended our pilgrimage through the days of slavery, the days of segregation, and the long nights of racism. It is God who gives us the strength and courage to continuously address injustice as a people and as a congregation. We constantly affirm our trust in God through cultural expression of a black worship service and ministries which address the black community." Close quote. So that's the famous unashamedly black, unapologetically Christian. The second is the black value system, which lays out 8 principles, which I won't go into for time's sake. Trinity was made up of an intimate and at times contentious group of inner-city Chicago Southsiders who were primed for an in-depth, educated exposition of the Bible. They yearned for institutions of service to the marginalized and communities that are outcasts. They relished the opportunity to create new ways of building a devastated physical area. And they enjoyed an occasional cutting sermon that spoke truth to power and called out names of those who had done wrong in contradiction to their interpretation of the Bible. At this point in our discussion, let's go back to the March 13th, 2008 bombshell that rocked the presidential election with the themes of race, religion, and presidential politics. We remember that ABC television released the 30-second sound bites that included 10 seconds each of 3 of Wright's previous sermons. Now, we also have to remember that Wright had been preaching at Trinity for 36 years. And each Sunday, Trinity held 3 services. And each Sunday, Wright had preached 3 new and different sermons every Sunday. So that meant of the 1,872 sermons Wright had preached in 36 years, the ABC reporter made a conscious decision to take 10 seconds from 3 specific sermons. In other words, out of the 7,500 minutes of Wright's sermons, the reporter lifted up 30 seconds of incomplete preaching. But still, if we were to review each of the 10 seconds in the 30-second sound bites, we might conclude a different perspective. For instance, in the 30-second sound bites, when Wright mentioned the phrase "chickens coming home to roost," he was actually quoting and paraphrasing Edward Peck. Peck had already expressed these same sentiments about September 11th. And this statement about chickens coming home to roost is talking about the notion of blowback violence. In international politics, there's a phrase called blowback violence. That is to say, a superpower country perpetrates violence against a smaller nation, and eventually the smaller nations will come back with their own violence. So in this sense, that violence blows back to the superpower nation. Also, we must remember who Edward Peck was. He was a former ambassador to Iraq. Peck had been associate director of a presidential anti-terrorist department. Peck had been part of the Reagan administration. And Peck had given his analysis with the phrase "chicken coming home to roost" 4 days after September 11th and the horrendous attacks of September 11th, and 1 day before Wright delivered his sermon. And Peck was a white man. I guess we should indicate that. So Ambassador Peck says these words the Saturday after November 11th. We recall November 11th took place on September 11th on Tuesday. That immediate Saturday, Ambassador Peck makes his remarks about blowback violence and chickens coming home to roost in reference to Tuesday. And then on the next Sunday, Wright preaches his sermon paraphrasing Ambassador Peck, formerly of the Reagan administration and associate director of the anti-terrorist task force. So he's paraphrasing Peck that next day. But at the same time, we do have to point out that Ambassador Peck did not say that his phrase "chicken come home to roost" with sort of the relish and intensity that Jeremiah Wright used in his sermon on that Sunday. But actually, that's the state of the black church. It's the joy and the anger, it's the love and the hatred, it's the clarity and confusion, all wrapped up in that one house, one building. Okay, so let's look at the other infamous sermonic soundbite of God Damn America. When Wright says God Damn America, he's actually using a specific intonation and an accent. He says, God Damn America. Now that accent and intonation is very different from our popular use of the phrase, and here, excuse my English in the church, God damn it. God damn it is a sort of vulgar, popular usage of language in America as a curse. But if you listen to the 30-second sound bites, you'll hear Wright saying, God damn America. That's a different intonation. And when Wright briefly mentioned God damn America, he believed that he was following the Hebrew scriptures, the so-called Old Testament, and the prophets. In those texts, Yahweh God made a covenant with the ancient Israel. Israel was given resources in abundance. And when Israel strayed from that covenant, Yahweh God raised up prophets as instruments of God's damnation. The deity used human beings to pronounce divine judgment and religious condemnation on a wayward nation. The second thing we need to observe in the Goddamn America snippet is that if we listen closely or even look closely, Wright is saying in the video, I'm in the Bible, it's in the Bible, and he points down to the lectern. Well, actually, he can actually make a case that he was preaching from the Bible. Damn can mean righteous indignation on the part of Yahweh God. It can mean divine judgment against the people and the people of God. So actually, as Wright says, in a sense, he was still following the Bible. It's just that the national and the international audiences that watched the 30-second sound bites did not see what Wright preached about before the sound bites and after the sound bites. Wright did an analysis of the characters and words in the biblical passage to which he referred, and then he applied his analysis to the wrong policies of the U.S. government and concluded, God damn America. In the biblical passage tradition to which he referred, there's a covenant or relationship between God, Yahweh, and the ancient people of Israel, and God calls them to be a special nation, a blessed nation. But if they break the covenant, then the Old Testament prophets, such as Jeremiah and Amos, will come forth and proclaim, thus saith the Lord. And they speak truth to power, and God will condemn this nation. God will damn the nation until it wakes up, the nation, and then turns toward the original path of justice and peace and positive relationship with all nations in the regions of the Mediterranean Sea. So it really is a prophetic task of moving the nation from where it is to the glory that it can be. And a prophet in the Bible gets impatient and can at times express some anger. So basically, Wright seems to be saying the following, and he's more or less saying, I'm speaking as a prophet for the word of God and his judgment on America because A, America hasn't used its resources to help its own oppressed citizens like African Americans. B, America hasn't helped working class people. And C, America has not used its foreign affairs policies and strength and leadership to bring about peace, something that it can do. Instead, it has bombed people. So on various levels, it seems that Wright is stating that the nation needs to be brought away from that wayward path and toward a more just and peace-loving path. The black church sermon can contain a range of emotions and practices, from damnation to seduction to cunning wit to theatrical performance. And to that degree, Wright was following the African-American sermonic outline of 5 steps to successful preaching. And again, more or less 4 or 5 steps. But usually the first step is where the preacher, he or she, takes a biblical passage and unpacks that passage. That's number 1. Black church, somehow you got to have it about. You may not follow the sermon, but the biblical passage. But number 1, start with the biblical passage. And when you look at that passage, this is still part of step 1, you unpack the story within that passage, the so-called pericope. You may do word studies, you may look at the personalities and figures in the story, you may look at the culture and context of the narrative in its own context. 1, take the Bible passage. 2, in black preaching, step 2 is when the preacher takes this in-depth study and applies it to the personal issues of healing, such as HIV and AIDS, such as domestic violence, such as the loneliness of single adults, issues of low self-esteem, and other things that keep people from feeling good about themselves. Take the biblical passage, apply it to the personal situation. Now, after applying the in-depth analysis of the Bible to personal and emotional concerns, the preacher takes this intensive study of the Bible and applies it to the prophetic message, step 3. Prophecy against unjust powers, against structures and systems. This is step 3, divine judgment, divine reckoning, and divine damnation. Now, the 4th step is when the preacher, he or she, brings everything together and offers the hope of a new life, both for the individual, which is part of step 2, and for the nation, which is part of step 3. And here in step 4, the preacher tells the congregation the following: now that you've gone through the horrendous nights of your personal issues and the intensity of the systems oppressing you, our next question is, how do we become holistic, integrated persons individually, psychically, emotionally, and systemically, as a person, as a people, as a nation, and as a world? We can do this now because God loves us. And after that, step 4 of telling people that God is the basis, God's love is the basis of integrated, holistic people, persons, nations, and world. Step 5 in the black church, I don't care what denomination it is, whether it's the Quakers to the Hallelujah Evangelicals. That's step 5 in black preaching. That preacher will tell the congregation that it can now enter that community of God's love. In fact, physically. That is why the majority of black churches in step 5, the preacher will say, the doors of the church are open. That's what that is. They've taken you from 1, unpacking a biblical narrative, 2, applying that narrative to the personal issues, spiritual issues, 3, applying that narrative to the God condemnation, damnation of society, 4, saying that you can be reintegrated back into a holistic person, nation, and world through God's love. And 5, institutionally, you can live out that new integrated self based on God's love in the church body. That's why you go to black church, at the end, the preacher's going to say, or maybe the deacon, the doors of the church are open. That's step 5. So what we have in those 30 seconds with Jeremiah Wright, we have step 3, the condemnation part. We don't get steps 1, 2, 4, and 5. All that he did was he sliced out step 3, the judgment part. And so we don't really get a full sense of at least the best of black preaching, where there's the hallelujah moment at the end, the celebratory moment, the God's love moment, the integration and reconciliation moment for all of God's children. And then the doors of the church are open. Now, because Barack Obama was not present at Trinity United Church during those 30-second sound bites aired by ABC, he condemned what he saw on television. As we know, he came out immediately that Friday with a press statement, and then he had his More Perfect Union speech on the following Tuesday. However, I think it's not only that Obama was not in the congregation of Trinity when Wright preached those sermons. I also think each man had different encounters with race, religion, and different life experiences. Barack Obama is white and black and immigrant and multicultural. Genetically white and intimately nurtured in America, white culture. In this sense, Obama is white. His mother and his grandparents hail from a white heartland America and semi-rural America. Growing up with a white mother and white grandparents, Obama caught a glimpse of how many white citizens expect society and expect government to respond to their needs. Socialization processes in the U.S., such as the media, education, movies, power positions, family, etc., these socialization processes can help white citizens imagine whatever options they wish to choose in life. Not only can one envision different options, one can also decide to implement and thus realize those dreams. And despite his grandmother mentioning her fears of inner-city black people, Obama grew up in a predominantly white environment that nurtured a view of government and American citizens as working together, as so each citizen could realize his or her desires. This perspective invites a career as a politician. Obama's white. Obama's also black. He recalls discussions of racial slights in his home. He writes about other personal incidents in his 2 best-selling books. and Obama recalls how he read accounts of racial discrimination against black people. Though not in Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement, Obama was aware of its challenges, its goals, and its setbacks. He's white, he's black. Obama also emerges from an immigrant sensibility. His father was from Kenya and immigrated to the United States voluntarily to get a prestigious education. Father Obama did not come to America to find the American dream, get married, have children, and seek permanent residence and naturalized citizenship. Rather, Mr. Obama saw the U.S. as a place to obtain the best resources and then return back to his own home in Kenya. The consciousness and history of the father Obama were not rooted in the usual black American story. Rather, his heart and priority were at home in Kenya. Now, this lineage of Obama contrasts with one narrative of many black Americans. That is to say, the majority of black Americans hail from the west coast of Africa that had empires, kings and queens and philosophers, and then they were involuntarily brought by white Christians of Western Europe through the slave trade, Triangle's Middle Passage in the 17th century, 300 years ago. And before those colonizers from Europe came to the continent, the usual African-American story tells of how West Africa had great leaders who were enslaved. And so the best of the empires were brought to the so-called 13 colonies. Again, in contrast, Obama is the son of a father from the east coast of Africa, a voluntary immigrant arriving at Harvard University 45 years ago. White, black, immigrant sensibility. In addition, Obama is multicultural. He grew up in Hawaii, the state that shows the beauty and possibilities of what all of the United States can become. We have to remember that Obama doesn't come to the rest of the United States until he's 22 years old. Although he's at Columbia, when you look at his books and also those who they've been interviewing at Columbia, he was somewhat reclusive and introvert. So he really become exposed to the rest of the mainland and become exposed, particularly African-American community, after 22 years of being a Hawaiian. While recognizing the justice issues of Hawaii's nationhood status as an ongoing struggle, Hawaii exhibits a different sensibility about human community. Obama emerged in this environment of Native Hawaiians, Japanese Hawaiians, and Chinese Hawaiians. Other groups live on the island, such as Pacific Islanders, whites, and blacks. In fact, to be in Hawaii is to be in an environment of many peoples, foods, and languages. Hawaii can suggest the possibility of multicultural tolerance in global communities settling among Native Hawaiians. In contrast, Jeremiah A. Wright hails from inner city Philadelphia and from a black community that traces parts of its root back to Virginia and the slavery era. And Wright is a third-generation black preacher. Wright's world was intensely racialized by the awareness of Africa's contributions to the humanity, his slavery history, northern racial discrimination, and the segregation he encountered when he went south for his BA degree. At the same time, Wright grew up in a loving household and city where black folks told folk tales, recounted the heroics of enslaved blacks, swayed with jazz rhythms, doo-wop, and R&B, and played the dozens on ghetto streets, corners in Philadelphia. Wright knew about other great black achievements such as the Harlem Renaissance, A. Philip Randolph's threat against FDR if the president didn't integrate the armed services, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. Wright speaks about his biological white racial embodiment when he describes how some southern white slave master raped an enslaved black woman. Out of this violent white-black intimacy comes Wright's own blood, as he says. This, however, did not erase his positive and formative experiences he had in Philadelphia with whites and other Jewish friends. Wright came to Chicago and there dedicated his ministry to the extremely racially segregated South Side. Chicago is classic black America with its family history links to the European slave trade on the African West Coast, U.S. slavery, segregation, and the almost Herculean efforts that blacks see themselves exerting to overcome the odds against them. Wright is part of this usual narrative. Here, black folks celebrate, worship in, and enjoy the cultural safety of other black people. At the same time, this black American narrative remembers the story of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment that the U.S. government carried out on black men's bodies. Wright emerges out of a specific lineage of black preaching as well. His father was a big-name Baptist preacher in Philadelphia, and his father was the son of a Baptist preacher. And thus, Jeremiah Wright Jr. symbolizes 3 generations of the prophetic wing of the black church, one where Christianity is empty rhetoric, if not linked to social justice and occasional prophetic denunciation of the powerful. And similarly, Wright actualizes a form of black religious speech that combines the fullness of the body with the intellect. Indeed, black preaching is a verbal and bodily ritual of performance. Wright and Obama, the preacher and the politician, race and multiculturalism have different parental, geographical, historical, and personal experiences. Yet both agree on the Bible as being partial to the poor. Both agree on church function as organizing justice. Wright is deeply connected to a segregated black community on the South Side and the importance of their voice in their obtaining resources for living. From that particularity, he bridges into conversation and coalition with all of America. In contrast, Obama begins with a vision for all of America. From that perspective, blacks are one strand among many in a larger narrative about whites and blacks, yellows, browns, and reds, all being their brothers and sisters' keepers. One is a preacher, rooted in the service to a local church. The other is a politician, moved to serve the larger nation. The preacher's prophetic vocation and the politician's universal inclination could have held together in one church building. Race and multiculturalism were wedded in one Christian institution. But with the intense media scrutiny at Trinity United Church of Christ, an experiment of these two differences, unified in faith and service to the poor, could not remain in close proximity in a presidential election year. And so the politician resigned his membership, so both he and the church could no longer be distracted. However, it seems to me in the long-term health of the nation, America needs both at the table of particularity and universality. Thank you. Okay, I think question and answers or comments, whatever. And I'll repeat the question. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a historian, and I've been reading some commentary about the African American narrative, which suggests that in Barack Obama being nominated for the president, and then, of course, if he wins, that the African American narrative will have to be changed. These individuals look at the African American narrative as being based primarily on victimization. These are not just conservative commentators. You gave, I think, a different sense of the African American narrative as achievement against the odds, which is what I would see it as. But I'm wondering if Barack Obama, if he's elected president, if that means that liberation has arrived, and if African American theology will likely change, as some people are suggesting the African American narrative will need to change.
Yeah, that's a great question. Whether or not, I think everybody heard that question. To me, the whole Barack Obama phenomena is a phenomenon, and it's a major historical move in this democratic project which we can call America. But to me, it's a phenomenon. It's not necessarily the full reality of what it means to be black in America. The hopefulness of the campaign, and I'm very enthusiastic about it, just put that out there, is because it opens up the possibility for a conversation of both the past, the present, and the future. The fact that go figure, who would have ever thought that black theology liberation and the black church would be at the center of the U.S. presidential, elections, both in the primaries and in the general election. So it's a powerful phenomenon that opens up the possibility. Now, what we do with it, those of us who are not Barack Obama, It's really, what we want to make of it. For me, what I want to say is that there's a possibility in the historical narrative of what is America, how we define America, for people of African descent to define who we are, who they are at this moment. One, because there's going to be somebody in the White House. I'm assuming that if he wins, he's going to be in the White House. So the issue of being black, being African, being whatever is going to be front and center, literally on all the front covers of the papers, on the magazines. So it's an opportunity for particularly African American people and all people who are concerned about, what we can be, to talk about what it is to be black. I don't think that whether he intended or not, the fact that he's black and if he's elected, that already symbolically reminds people sort of every day that there are black people in America. So in that sense, it would be a positive thing for us to talk about. Structurally, traditionally, historically, everything that existed before Barack Obama announced in February 2007 in Springfield, Illinois, still exists today. Nothing has fundamentally changed on the south side of Chicago. And so we have got to, remember that as people who trust him, believe in him and his vision, and vote for him to do that, one. And two, we also have to, as I said, use the opportunity to retell the story of that black people not only have a history of structural oppression, but we have a history of being Africans prior to the European slave trade. And I usually say the European Christian slave trade. And fundamentally, theoretically, it's the issue of if we say that blacks were created as victims as a result of the European slave trade, that beginning the story of what it means to be black that way takes away the agency. But I always start with West Africa. As a theologian and as a Christian theologian who loves all kinds of things, Taoism and all kinds of funny, weird things I love, I say, look, God created me in West Africa prior to the European slave trade. There was agency there, and there were problems. Okay, but hey, every empire, every state has its right to have its own funky problems, okay? That doesn't mean another country from Europe has to come in and disrupts that. So I always start the story with agency and responsibility and power. And as a theologian, I interject that the God plus gods were part of that reality. Now, so to me, the debate is whether or not, when did African Americans become African Americans in the sense that we know today? Was it August 1619? Or was it, centuries prior to that? And so I think, even common sense could say, how can people be created ex nihilo? I mean, just even make common sense, let alone having a PhD to try to figure it out. So yeah, I think we've got to continue to tell that story, both the structural reality that the south side of Chicago is fundamentally the same. It's gotten worse since the crash of the Depression. But also we got to lay out the agency piece, the history of what it means to be an African American. Yeah. Yes, please.
Your reply intrigues me very much because just to, in a way, I suppose support the point you're making. The fact that a black individual may occupy the White House doesn't necessarily imply in the short or long run a significant change in systemic conditions that the black community faces. Because I'm very clear in my mind that Barack has a very heavy road to travel if he gets in, because there are constraints in the wider American system. Compromises have to be struck. People are going to be disappointed in some of these positions, which on a realistic level I can understand. So we have to be very careful not to put too much. I mean, it's a threshold if a black becomes president, don't get me wrong. But there are still a lot of systemic conditions and challenges to be faced. But I want to go to a larger picture. You mentioned black liberation theology. We know in Latin America, liberation theology was very much in the picture from the 1960s, early 70s, if I remember rightly, perhaps earlier. Even Ronald Reagan spoke against it. He saw it as a total radical thing. What was the connection, if any, between the black liberation theology ethos and the other liberation theology thing which came out of the third world, if I may use that term advisedly, the masses in Latin America, in Africa, and so forth. Those are my two.
Great.
One comment, one question, and since I'm up on my feet, I will say a third. You distinguish MLK, Black Power, whatnot, I understand that. But to what extent might there be some glimpses of Black liberation theology in the pre-Black Power era, and even in King's own philosophy, where he used the concept of Christianity, of faith, as a way of mobilizing people against the status quo?
Excellent question. Excellent question. The issue of Black theology, liberation, USA, in relationship to Latin American liberation theology and other third world, they all developed, as I'm sure you know by the cogency of your question, that they all developed independently. The black pastors and church administrators who published the July 31st, 1966 ad in the New York Times, up to Cone's first book, March 1969, Black Theology and Black Power. That grouping of first generation of black theologians were developing the notion of liberation, of black theology of liberation, independent of Latin American liberation. One thing, that they didn't know how to speak Spanish or read Spanish, so that would have been a problem there. But they didn't really have a physical contact with Latin America, like Gustavo Gutierrez in particular in Lima, Peru. So Cone publishes his book, March 1979, Black Theology and Black Power. And then in 1970, a year later, he published his second book, A Black Theology of Liberation. Gustavo Gutierrez's first Spanish book, A Theology of Liberation, comes out in 71, the first edition in Spanish. In 1973, Orbis publishes the first English translation. So in fact, Cone had already published 2 books before 71. And again, it's not to say who's more liberation than the other. It's just to lay out the historical fact. One other difference is that Latin American liberation theology comes out of that sort of struggle of, repression and colonialism and Pinochet and all of that stuff. And they also come out of the more positive agency part of their history, where peasants are struggled, campesinos and workers are striking, and women are beating pots and pans in countries in Latin America against fascism and U.S. occupation. And that part of their struggle draws a lot on Marxism. In contrast, the Black theology of liberation in the United States is totally indigenous. They are forced toward radical analysis as a result of the movement and the community. And that forces the pastors to reread the Bible. And when they reread the Bible, they began to see more clearly the liberation message. So Marxism or radical analysis came more indigenous from the black community's push or pull within its own context, which is a little different from the historical liberation theology, which had a little more, I think, Marxism brought in from, say, European studies or whatever. So there are some differences there. The other question, there are some historical antecedents to black theology liberation. Usually we say contemporary black theology liberation, meaning July 31st, 1966 as the beginning. But we don't even have to go back too far to Marcus Garvey, Henry McNeill Turner, God is a Negro. Marcus Garvey's God is black, and he set up a black church. We can go literally the historical foundation of black liberation theology of the 60s is a slave narrative. And you have one of the authorities in the world on your faculty about that. But just stay with your point of Dr. King. If we look at King, particularly from 66 to 68, although he does not use the phrase black theology liberation, he does talk about the importance of using power, that Negroes need power. And yes, we need to stand up and reclaim our manhood. I'm paraphrasing him, at a speech he gave in South Carolina in August of 1966 to the staff of the Civil Rights Movement. And he said the very first next task we have to do in the movement now is black culture, our identity. And he says to stand up against the crimes, and I'm paraphrasing, that the white man, that's his phrase, has caused against us. So he even sounds a little Malcolm X-ish by the end of his life on certain points. But yes, I would consider him a forerunner of black theological liberation without trying to impose my category on how he saw himself. I think he saw himself as a Baptist preacher who was following the call of Jesus Christ, and no matter where it led, that's where he was going to go. Yeah, so good. So on those two points, and just basically comment, on the first your comment or comment on your comment, on my comment, I think that I work with a group of about 14 black men on the south side of Chicago. I work with them on my local, accountability community work. And in the beginning of, in the spring of, in 2007, last year, when Obama announced, and a couple months after, we meet twice a month. And they were saying, oh man, he ain't black enough, man. The brother ain't down, man. He ain't like, no, he come out Hyde Park. He over there with you at the University of Chicago. These are brothers. These are South Side Chicago, okay? It's a different crowd from this audience, okay? And, they were all talking. I said, look, man, there's three things. This is why I support Obama. This is back in the day, right? Three things. One, I recognize that whoever runs for president is going to have to make compromise. So it's a sober assessment that I have no illusions about him walking on water, right? Two, I support him because which presidential candidate creates the most mobilized citizenry? And three, as a community organizer, what do I want to do with those two things? And those are my three things for supporting Obama. And I think that, I've held to that. And, so the thing is, it's not Obama, Obama's mama, whatever it is. It's not the phenomenon of Obama. It's what people are doing. It really is. I think there are two things happening with the, and I did a lot of media, as I mentioned. There are two things happening in the primaries and now in the general election. One is this cultural phenomenon of the media. What did Hillary say? What did she mean? And what did Bill say in the primaries, right? Remember all of that? And then now it's the general election. Sarah paled up, Sarah paled down. Obama took his tie off. Obama has short sleeves on today. Joe Biden talks this way, and gosh, what happened? Look at, Cindy McCain, she never Cindy McCain never shakes hands at rallies. You notice that? She never goes to the rope line. She rarely does. She did it once. So all this is the media. The other thing is what's happening on the ground. Now, I have to admit, after I graduated from college in 1976, I went to Harlem. I was a community organizer for 5 years before I went to seminary. And when Obama announced on the internet and what he announced in the State House, I said, aha. He just sees the United States as the South Side of Chicago. And you organize it like that. Community organizer, one of the first of the community organizing tradition I come out of, 5 years in Harlem. One you do is you inspire people to believe that they can change their reality. Not out there, but in their neighborhood. That's one. Two, you provide them the tools so they can organize themselves, so you don't have to do the work. Okay? And three, this is the most fundamental, you have to believe that people change history. If the third one is not there, it's not going to work. So at least those three things. And so, for 5 years, my own community organizing, when it seems to me that's what he's embodying. So really, it's these two things. It's that media frenzy, because I was doing media almost 24/7 for about 4 or 5, and I got like 5 more interviews, literally down to Tuesday morning next week, November 4th. Then hopefully I'll be finished with media. And I was talking to people, television, radio, blogging and telephone, and they were then I would be working on the South Side, dealing with Trinity, sort of plugging into what Obama's doing on the ground. It's just two different realities. It's not that either one is better than the other. It's just to show that there's this different reality. So the question to me is, Obama provides that covering for what's on the ground. And there's a system since he announced and everybody else announced in January, February 2007, the situation in South Side Chicago has gotten worse. Because there's these systems and structures that you obviously rightly put forth. And then I don't know how much time we have, but I just want to say, I think that what's happening in this presidential race 2008 represents one of the most energetic, creative, enlivening processes in the democratic experiment in this country. And again, I'm very clear on white supremacy and structured reading in my book. So, but it's just that I'm so excited because just think, we had, like on the Republican side, we have a war hero, right? Also had a Mormon. You know, rarely have we an LDS running for president, right? And then the big five of the Democratic, we had a black man, a white woman, a Latino. We had a white Southerner who was dang near basically a socialist, John Edwards. And I forget the fifth person, but we've never had this combination of people running for the President of the United States, ever, you know. And we've never had a campaign, regardless of who we vote for or what we think about him or her or whatever, that has enlivened people in the base like this. You know, it's just incredible. You know, it's just an amazing phenomenon. So I think that with history, we'll look back and see this as a major turning period for America. If not a major turning period for America, a major possibility of what America could be as a threshold issue, not the end point, but the beginning point. Because Obama, if he's elected, he's going to have a whole lot to deal with. And that's why, for me, of the two phenomena, the media stuff that goes on, you know, Sarah Palin, there's a hair up. Next day, Sarah Palin, hair down. Next day, Obama took his shirt off. Next day, where's Hillary? Next day, is Bill going to embrace? I mean, it's just, if you look at the media going, your head will be spinning like this every day, right? I mean, there's that phenomenon. But the other phenomenon is a steady ground game. If you've ever been a community organizer, you can appreciate that ground game. You just keep going. So, thank you very much.
To do so as we formally close today's event, which is the last in a series of programs on race in the U.S. presidency co-sponsored by Cornell United Religious Work and the Africana Studies and Research Center. I want to thank you, Dr. Hopkins, for a superb presentation and question and answer session. Welcome.